Welcome, we're glad you're here. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Eric White. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the library. We are excited to have local author Aimie Runyan here to talk about her latest novel, The Wandering Season. I'll introduce Aimie momentarily. First, our usual disclaimer. We like to remind everyone that the library sees part of its job as bringing in speakers to share their own perspectives for the enrichment of the community. Speakers' perspectives are purely their own. We don't tell them what to say, and we don't think you'd want us to. All right, so now I'd like to introduce tonight's honored guest. Internationally best-selling author Aimie K. Runyan writes to celebrate unsung heroines. She has written numerous successful historical novels and is loving her foray into the exciting world of contemporary fiction. She is a many-time finalist for the Colorado Book Award, a nominee for the Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers Writer of the Year, and a Historical Novel Society Editor's Choice Selection, and most recently has been long-listed for the Reading the West Awards for her two novels, The Memory of Lavender and Sage and Mademoiselle Eiffel. Aimie is an adjunct professor for the Drexel University MFA in Creative Writing program and strives to be an active speaker and educator in the writing community. She lives right here in the Estes Valley with her wonderful husband, two usually adorable children, two always adorable cats, and a dragon. Welcome, Aimie Runyan.
Myself. Okay, everybody can hear me. I usually don't need a mic to be heard, but we got to be heard for our folks online. First of all, a thank you to all of you coming out in this snowy April evening. I know that it's not always the funnest thing in the world to drive in the snow, so I appreciate you guys coming out. So wonderful to spend a Friday evening with you all and everybody online. Thank you so much. And I have to thank the library for hosting me. And not only that, for just being a staple in my life. I live right here in Estes Park. And there isn't a week that goes by that I don't come by to pick up a stack of old books about like yay, whether it be for my own research for books or for my husband, my children, what have you. And I think that we are so lucky in Estes Park to have this amazing library system. I know that it makes my job a lot easier. So thank you very much. And to our good friends at McDonald's Bookshop, they are the most supportive bookstore ever on the face of the planet. And I love them. And I'm basically an honorary employee. So if you see me there, chances are I can't ring you up, but I can give you some advice. But well, okay, so we're here mostly to talk about The Wandering Season, though we can go off book as much as you like, especially once we hit the Q&A. And I thought I would start off before I start talking about the book with a little reading. And I'm going to violate one of my few rules, and I'm actually going to read from chapter 1. Usually I don't, because that is the sample you can often find online. And it's a good idea. Always check the samples that they offer, so to see if you're going to like a book, so you don't end up buying a book you're not going to be into. But it's set in Estes Park. And I felt like I really want to read this chapter tonight, or not the whole thing, but. So December 24, Estes Park, Colorado. Colorado snow is charming in December, as winter was just making herself at home. Rarely was there more than a heavy dusting, a few inches at the outside, and it had the good manners to depart within a day or two. The more insistent snow, the kind that wore out its welcome in a hurry, was reserved for March and April. The time when every sane person wanted to vacate the state of Colorado in favor of a beach and a rum-based cocktail, preferably with a magenta paper umbrella in it. Instead, most of us went skiing, which at least made putting up with the snow feel worthwhile. I loved the wintry whimsy of the tree-lined drive up the mountains, and as I pulled in in front of my parents' cabin, I was glad I'd made the trek alone. At least that's what I told myself. I certainly felt relief that Jonathan wasn't turning 7 shades of Kermit the Frog green in the passenger seat, but at some point, someone would question his absence. My boyfriend of 4 years had always hated the windy drive up Highway 36 from Denver, even though he'd always been the one behind the wheel. He was a California boy lured to Denver by good jobs and the scenery. He loved Colorado, but he was more comfortable in an LA gridlock than he was on a mountain road. He had usually opted out of trips to see my parents since he was so prone to motion sickness, preferring to see them when they came down to the city where we lived and worked. I sense he was low-key baffled as to why they'd retired to such a place. Yeah, it was a gateway to Rocky Mountain National Park. Sure, it had world-class hiking and some of the most stunning mountain views in the world. But a lot of great hiking and scenery could be found elsewhere in the state on four-lane highways that didn't twist like a fine Laguiole sommelier's corkscrew. He never understood our attachment to Estes, and that was okay. Some things could only be explained by a childhood full of memories. But his barely veiled disdain for the small mountain town was just another reason why our recent split didn't hurt as much as it should have. The place didn't have to be important to him, but it should have mattered that it was important to me, to us. The breakup was ultimately the right decision, but it would bring the conversation to other areas of my life that didn't quite sit well with the rest of the family. I was almost 27, and they expected me to have graduated culinary school and to be well on my way to a Michelin star by now, but I had subverted their expectations. I took a steadying breath and went into the cargo area of my 9-year-old Toyota SUV. I hoisted out the heaviest of boxes, trying not to grunt under the strain of small batch Hawaiian vanilla pods, ethically sourced cocoa, and a ton of freshly ground almond flour and quinoa for the gluten-free menu at my mother's bakery. Left to haul in was a case of Colorado wine Mom was partial to, a bottle of the locally distilled whiskey for Dad, and Avery's favorite truffle chips. Those things weren't for the shop, but rather because my parents had become like family to my vendors. Dad rushed over from the front porch to relieve me of the box. Holy cow, Shortcake, did you leave any food in Denver? I kissed his cheek in greeting before I grabbed another load from the cargo area. A bit, but I have to help Mom replenish her stock of vanilla. Just don't eat in too far into your profit margins, kiddo. My heart tugged a bit. He wanted to press further, but he wasn't going to because of the holiday. He was always more than a little worried that my niche business ran too close to the red. And some months that was true. But as more time passed, the larger and more impressive my client list became, I didn't hold my breath when the rent came due anymore. And there was no better feeling than to have that small sense of security. My little venture was called the Kitchen Muse. I was a food broker, but more specialized. I wasn't the person to get you a dozen 100-pound bags of brand name flour, but I could be counted on to let you know what farm had the best spinach this year and would drive to Hatch, New Mexico for a client to ensure the best pickings of pickings during green chili season. I like to consider myself a food matchmaker. If a restaurant or gourmet boutique shop was in need of truffles or from a specific region of Italy, I was the girl to call. Closer to home, I could work magic. If a mom and pop kitchen out of Boulder was making standout artisanal cheese and charcuterie meats, I would help them find outlets to sell their goods and hopefully expand their business. For this reason, my SUV often smelled like a farmer's market stall rather than a store-bought air freshener, and I loved it. So that is Veronica Stratton, our protagonist in a nutshell. And she is a specialty food broker who knows the Colorado market like the back of her hand. And when I pitched the idea of this book, a woman who, at a Christmas function, her younger sister is about to come in and she's going to give everybody DNA kits for Christmas. And, because that was a thing, especially a few years ago, everybody getting the 23andMe kits. And I know I certainly did that for my family back in 2020. And it was funny because that was kind of the inspiration for the whole book. My parents didn't take the test for 2 years. Like, what are you hiding, Mom and Dad? And so that was kind of a fun little nugget to put into a story. And what it turns out is that Veronica is indeed adopted. I think we all at some point in our lives wonder, am I possibly related to these people? Seriously? And in Veronica's case, she's actually right. And so, kind of to emulate my own self, she's short and redheaded. I'm short and blonde. Her family are all tall, dark Italianate, swarthy folks. Kind of same with my family. They're almost 6 feet tall, but we found out we actually are related. But it is that feeling of not quite belonging. And she internalizes it. She wonders, like, why didn't they tell me? Why didn't, she doesn't go to them with a question. And she says for years and years, it doesn't matter. They're my parents. I love them. And, biology doesn't matter. Biology doesn't matter. But she internalizes it in a way that she begins to shrink and to make less courageous decisions for herself. And so her, trying to convince herself that everything is just hunky dory is just her way of rationalizing it to herself. And so this is all a journey about Veronica visiting all the places that her ancestry, that came back on her ancestry report. Her parents, her sister, and her best friend concoct this trip for her to go visit Ireland. And so County Mayo in Ireland and the Dordogne in the southwest of France, which is charming. A lovely little farm outside of Milan, and then Copenhagen, the bustling city, and she also ends up in New York. She does a fair amount of wandering in one January, and it's all about her trying to find herself, and they want to get her out of her own head. It was the original expectation, but it becomes bigger than that. When she happens on a place that is significant to one of her ancestors, she ends up having little echoes or visions of her, what she realizes later are her foremothers. These are all women from her family tree, and it's all on the moment when they decide to come to America. And that's significant because that's a culminating decision that leads to her becoming a human being. And, it's kind of baffling to think about how if one decision in one of our ancestors had made differently, we wouldn't be here. And we don't get into the depths of that kind of like, the quantum leap issue in our book, but there is a sense of the importance of place when it comes to our, where we're rooted. And the idea for this book, aside from the funny story of my parents kind of refusing to spit in a tube for a couple years, I was driving around in Provence with my wonderful husband, Jeremy, and his folks are in the back of the room. So thank you for coming. And we were driving around, not a big surprise if you know us, we're big road trippers. And we were in Provence, and I was doing some research for the memory of lavender and sage. And it was a place that felt significant. It was, and I talk about this a lot in the memory of lavender and sage. Provence is where I went when I was 18 years old. I was a sophomore in college, and it was what I needed to do to continue my master or my undergraduate degree. My major was to spend a year in France, and I chose Provence because nice weather is nice, and it was just a place that resonated with me on a really deep level. And in some cases, it really felt like deja vu, even though I'd obviously never been to this place before. I'd only been on an airplane once before I'd gone to France. It was like all the way from Sacramento to Portland, Oregon. And so the second trip was like all the way to Paris. And it was my first significant time, where I didn't have some family member or another an hour living in at least an hour, no further than an hour away. And it was where I really left the last vestiges of my childhood behind. So it always felt very significant to me as a place. But then in the course of my travels, there have been places that felt so familiar and so wonderful that I wanted that I didn't know why. And so this is taking that kind of eerie feeling of deja vu and turning it up to 11 and actually seeing those memories of her foremothers coming to life. So there is a magical realism element in it, which was immensely fun to write, extremely hard to do well, because I think that the important part of magical realism is the realism part and making it seem at least believable. But, these could all be explained as hallucinations of somebody who's very jet lagged and going through a lot of emotional trauma. And you can read it that way if you choose, or you can read it as, a genuine manifestation of the memories of these places. And it's a theme that comes back in a lot of my books, in particular my contemporary books, but setting and place are so important. And that's why I insisted on writing the opening and the ending chapters in Estes Park. And I remember when I pitched the idea to my wonderful editors at HarperCollins, and they said, okay, you can obviously it makes sense. The real world for her is Denver, Estes Park. That's fine, but get her to Europe. Don't dilly dally. I'm like, you don't worry about it. I'm going to make Estes Park charming. you East Coast people, you don't know how charming this place is. And it really was a delight to write about a place that has been so significant in my life. I moved up here because I dated this wonderful historian, and I saw, I was living down in the plains, and was starting my dating adventure, and I see history professor in Estes Park. Yes, please swipe right. And and so because it was a place where I had come every year for my birthday, long before I met my wonderful husband, and we ended up buying a home here and raising our children here, to be close to his wonderful parents, and just because it is where we love to be, and it always has felt like, it was a place that was a special treat, and now it's home, and so I loved writing about Estes Park. And the drive, her kind of being glad that her boyfriend driving up, not turning Kermit the Frog green. Well, my daughter turns Kermit the Frog green on the way up a lot too. And the drive up 36, and then just the feeling of calm and serenity when you get into town is something that I've experienced so many times, and I was just a joy to encapsulate that on paper. So, and on my trip in Provence and all over, we were going all over Europe. We had the chance to visit Randonnée in France, which was a village where my ancestors had come from. And my ancestor, Pierre de la Tremblay, my maiden name is Tremblay, he was famous for leaving the place. Basically, they had a monument in his honor and a town square named after his wife, Ozanne. Great name. I need to use that in the book someday. And but it felt, there was something desolate about the place, and I could feel a sadness when I was there, and I could understand why he left. I could imagine it being a place where opportunity, it seemed like a hard place to farm. It seemed like a place where there wasn't a lot of opportunity. And then he moved to French Canada, and he was, became a biological legacy there, because there are more Trumbull is like Smith in French Canada. It's crazy. And so it's the largest French Canadian family in North America, and that was super cool to visit that place and to feel that connection. And we visited Erzberg in Germany, which was important to my husband's lineage. And so that's kind of where the entire idea came out. And a common question I'm asked is, well, how did you choose Veronica's lineage? And I kind of modeled it loosely on my own 23andMe results. I'm trying to delete my data off that mess right now. We'll see if I'm able to do that. Oh, the stories. But and I'm glad I was able to do it before the whole bankruptcy thing happened, because it's fun to have that information. Um, but when I got my results, I kind of thought that it was the most genuine thing to do was to model it after my own results. And so lots of Irish. I am over 50% Irish. 3/4 of my grandparents tossed into the Irish pot, so to speak, and in the melting pot that is me. And there's a good dollop of French. I didn't put the Dutch in there, but and my grandfather, who passed away before I was born, was Danish. And there's this tiny little sliver of Italian. I have no idea how that came in there, but I thought it was fun to include it, because that's actually her connection to her adoptive family. They're Italian as well. And there's a chapter where Avery kind of latches onto that. Like, we have that little fragment in common, because she's worried that she's going to lose that connection with her big sister. And so there are definitely some hard themes about adoption. My best friend's husband was adopted, and he grew up knowing it. But fun story, when he took his test, he found out he had a half brother living 3 miles away, despite having been adopted and growing up in Houston and Louisiana. So that was crazy, that he ended up having a half brother living 3 miles away in like Frederick, Colorado. So that was, one of those stories where, the outcome was happy. He got to meet his birth mother, but there's difficulty there too. And I think that adoption stories are complicated. I think that there's the idea that you have these wonderful savior parents that come in and rescue this unwanted baby, and it all turns out great. But there are big feelings. There are big feelings to be dealt with, and I do my best, having not been adopted, despite my own intuition to the contrary, to deal with that in a sensitive manner. And it really was a joy to write. And part of the reason I chose these specific locations in these countries was because, partially because they're amazing places to go, but they are places that spoke to me. And I got to go to Ireland last summer while I was putting the finishing touches on the book, and County Mayo really did feel, and a lot of Ireland really did kind of feel like home. And it was fun to kind of capture that on the page as well. And I spent a year learning Irish on Duolingo. I don't include all that much in the book, if any, but it's that kind of exploring our own roots was it was something that I found compelling, and I hope you guys will too. And so that is the wandering season in a nutshell. I have been writing seriously since about 2013. As when my daughter started sleeping through the night. Was actually, I guess it was 2012. Wait, no, it had been 2013, doing the math. And so I started regaining a bit of my own sanity. And I decided I had started what would become my first book back in 2003. And as it was a short story about the women who were sent over from France to Canada as mail order brides uh, under the auspices of Louis XIV. And it was a motive, it was a whole program to help populate French Canada. And I was in grad school at the time, not having a great time of it, but I was in a Canadian Civ class with a professor I loved and I thought was fascinating. And I was also taking a creative writing class for the second time ever in my entire life. And so that the nice thing about that is that it puts you into idea seeking mode if you don't have something in the works. And the professor started talking about the filles du roi, the king's daughters, the women that were sent over with a dowry and a trousseau in order to help increase the population in French Canada. And I'm like, well, there's a story right there. And I wrote it, and everybody's comment was, well, it's really well done, but it feels like the first chapter of a novel. I said, well, that's not a terrible problem to have. And so I took all those notes and they literally languished in a drawer for about 10 years. I got busy, teaching French. That was my day job for many, many years. And I ended up, I got married, had a couple of children. That takes up a lot of time. And I ended up, one day I'd read a really bad book. It was really terrible. I'm like, I can do better than this. And so I decided, because I guarded that hour and a half, 2 hours when the kids were napping in the afternoon, that was my time. And I think that that's an important thing for anybody who is an aspiring author or artist or anybody that has a passion outside of their 9 to 5 job, and I hope we all do, I am entitled to spend an hour or two on myself every day. Is that coming from a place of extreme privilege? Yes, and I admit that. But I was working, teaching online before it was even cool. And I was doing it with very little childcare, and my ex-husband was putting in long hours, and the kids were under the age of 3. And if I were going to do something that was going to feed my soul, it had to be done at my house. Could not bundle the kids up and go see the Taj Mahal or do that sort of thing, see the world. So I decided to finish the book, and I'm very glad I did. In 6 months, I had a terrible draft, and then I worked to make it less terrible. And the most important thing I did was I invested in myself. I went to a writers conference, Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers in Denver, and I met contacts. I submitted that same first chapter that I'd started 10 years before in the writing contest, and I finaled in the Colorado Gold contest and was told by a very prominent Denver agent that it was terrible and she didn't like it. But then I had another agent. This was really, she's like, I didn't like it. I didn't resonate with the character at all. I thought it was dreadful. And then I had another agent who was Canadian say, I'm going to tell you this in very hushed tones. This is the most exciting thing I've heard about all weekend. And she did, and she requested the full manuscript right then and there. So that was a lesson in the fact that two people who are very highly regarded in the industry can have extremely different opinions. She ended up not representing the manuscript, but I did get an agent on that very same manuscript 4 or 5 months later via a Twitter contest of all things. And she sold the book in 4 months. And that became Promise to the Crown, which came out in 2016. And so, yeah, my overnight success story took about 13 years, which is not unusual. But those books didn't do well. The first two books kind of just fizzled out, and that happens so often. It was basically something they were willing to take a risk on. It was a funny thing is that historical fiction in particular goes in waves. For the longest time in that era, it was the Tudors. And I'm actually watching some of the shows right now that led to that with the Philippa Gregory, the White Queen, the Red Queen, the White Princess, the Kingmaker, all those books, which are fabulous. And I love them, and I was obsessed with them back then. And they're wonderful, but they were running their course. I mean, people go through moods, right? And they weren't sure what was going to be next. And it was not Canadian colonials, darn it. It was World War II. And so instead of just like, oh, my first two books crashed and burned miserably, my career is over, which a lot of people would tell you, if you have a book fail, it is very hard to get another contract, which is true. But I am also exceedingly stubborn. And so I went to my agent, Melissa, and I showed her my idea file, which I literally have. It was just a list of ideas. It's more complex now than it was back then. And she said, Russian female fighter pilots in World War II. That's your money pitch, kid. Write me that book. And I'm halfway through writing that book. And Kate Quinn, anybody familiar with Kate Quinn, the amazing Kate Quinn, who is now my dear friend, she posts on Facebook, I stayed up way too late last night researching Russian female fighter pilots in World War II. And a cloud of expletives is still hanging over Black Forest, Colorado, where I lived at the time. And I realized that she was writing about the same thing, which is so hard in historical fiction because you are dealing with a limited list of topics because history is finite. And especially you're talking about the same 5-6 year period, very finite. And so I messaged her in a moment of extreme professionalism and said, Kate, you cannot do this to me. This is going to be my big breakout book. You can't. And she said, calm down, kid. And she's like 3 years younger than me. This happens all the time. I had to write a book about the Borgias when another big name author was doing the same. We'll be fine. And we ended up just quietly, doing our own books separately. We made sure we were not naming the characters the same thing, and we'd occasionally trade resources and research tidbits. And thankfully, my book came out first, and it was a big success. And I'm very grateful for that because that changed the trajectory to pivot. And sometimes that's just what has to be done. You have to pivot. And so I worked on 3 different World War II, World War I novels for my second publisher, Lake Union, and they did well. And the cool thing was that my previous publisher, Kensington, decided they were. Oh, I think my mic cut out. Anyway, in order to bolster the success of my backlist. And they did a price promotion, and it ended up like my book earned out, and they sold 4,500 copies in one day because of one price promotion of my debut book. And those books have earned out, which is an amazing feeling. It is an amazing feeling. So for those of you who aren't aware of the term, earned out is where you get an advance. Let's say it's $10,000, which was actually more than I got for my first couple books. Nice round figure. Let's say it's $10,000, and the money that you'll get generally like half of it up front and half on publishing. Or if it's larger, you get a third up front, a third when they accept the manuscript, and then a third at publication. It just depends on how big it is. Sometimes it's quarters if it's a really big advance or is a really stingy publisher. And but you don't see any more money until enough copies of the book have sold that your amount equals more than $10,000. And on every book, that's priced, let's say this book is priced at $20. If I'm getting 10% royalties, that means I get $2. So that means that you have to earn out that number of they have to sell that number of copies in order to start getting royalty checks, which are a beautiful thing. And so that's what earning out means. And the goal is for every book to earn out so that you can start seeing royalties, but it also is a signal to publishers that you're worthy of the advances they're paying you. And of course, the sooner you earn out, the better. And but it's very competitive. So I ended up writing 3 books for Lake Union, and I had a book come out in August of 2020. We all know what was happening, right? And it was not a great time to be selling books that summer. It just wasn't. Everybody was gripped to the news, and everybody was, in a state of malaise. And I ended up pivoting and coming back to the Big Five with HarperCollins for my next book, which was The School for German Brides, which did beautifully well. And I wrote another couple books for them. But in the midst of all this, the writing world, it is the least secure job you're ever going to have, probably. And the closest thing you can have is, multiple income streams and trying to write more than one book a year if you're insane. And I wrote 2 1/3 last year, so that you can make of that what you will. But I decided I wanted to write a contemporary line, and there was, Thomas Nelson, which is a publisher that's been around since 1793. They had a lot of success, even though they were like originally a Christian publisher. They'd started working in mainstream historical books and other, a mainstream like Southern fiction and women's fiction. And so they got permission to open up their own imprint for non-Christian, because so you're not going to find a lot of inspirational content in my books because I'm not equipped to write that. But they have a few rules, it's going to be clean, not a lot of cussing and things like that, which is fine. There's a huge market for people that don't want to read swear word ridden, books, which can be very lazy, or sometimes it's very effective. I'm known to drop an F-bomb here and there in some of my books. If a plane is crashing, I'm not going to say, oh, golly, gosh, darn, heck. You've got to bust out the big words sometimes. But with Harper Muse, they took a chance on me starting a completely different genre, and I pitched it as virtual vacation fiction. I pitched this in late 2020, and I said I want to write books that are going to transport people out of what we're doing, and it's we're not under the same level of regulations anymore. Despite COVID still being around, but I think we all need to be transported to new places and to get away, and for people who love to travel, it's an escape. For people who never have had the chance to travel, it's an opportunity for them to experience new places. And I work very hard and I endeavor to create books that are really immersive. And there's a huge theme of food in a lot of my books. I'm going to make my blood sugar problems yours, and because I'm constantly hungry. But it's also about exploring culture through food. And I open the book with a couple of epigraphs, I think is the term, the fancy literary term. Oh, that's my dedication. My friend Kim. I dedicated this book to my friend Kim, who's also a Harper Muse author, because she titled this book that I could not title myself. And she's a wonderful friend. It's around the table and in the preparation of food, we learn about ourselves and about the world. And that's by Alice Waters, who's the guru of the farm to table movement in the 1960s in Berkeley. She is a maven of the food world. Love her. And then this one's from a YouTuber, and I don't care that it's a YouTuber because I love this quote. The stove is the shrine where I convene with my ancestors. I love that because food, I mean, we can talk about, we can have like a 4-hour long debate about cultural appropriation, but the place where I think that we have to have hands off when it comes to any idea of cultural appropriation is food. That is what we share with other cultures to let them know about our values, let them know about, about what, our country and what we grow and what we value, because I think it is a sacred part of who we are. And, we laugh about Americans' obsession with fast food and McDonald's, and there is an affect of, the deeply internalized capitalism that forces us to eat quickly. But I think there has been a rejection of that to a large degree. And I have to admit to having eaten McDonald's French fries just today. Sorry. But a rejection of, the fast food culture. And I mean, the fact that we have things like Food Network and HGTV that are centered around going back and learning how to cook. And it started with Julia Child back in the 1950s and 60s, who taught America that food didn't have to come out of a box. And sometimes it's fine when it does. Veronica even says, I'm not above Pepperidge Farm cookies. What are you talking about? And because they are delightful, let's be honest. Not everything has to be, high haute cuisine. But it's amazing how accessible good haute cuisine can be. in France, and the things that we think are. I remember going to France and thinking all these things that I thought were impossibly complicated were everyday food there, and it's partially because there is a value placed on food, and I know that this is diminishing, which was really tragic, even compared to when I lived there 20 odd years ago. I'm not going to do the math and find out it's more than 30 years. We're going to say it's 20 odd years ago. Okay, I think we are still 20 years. But the people would, even in Avignon, I lived in Avignon, which is a sizable city. My host mother would go twice weekly to the local like outdoor market and buy fresh produce. She would, when she went to go buy cheese, she would go to the fromagière. She would go to the butcher to get meat. She would go to the boulangerie to get bread every single day, and or send me to do it. That was one of my tasks, which I love doing. I became friends with the bakers, and I should have done a stage there, an internship to learn how to bake the amazing bread. And it's really just fascinating how they value. It's worth spending the time to source the ingredients in little specialty boutiques. Sure, all French people go to the supermarket to buy a box of pasta or what have you, but they source out, important ingredients like the meat, the cheese, and wine, and the baked goods at specialty boutiques even now. Instead of driving to the mega malls on the outside skirts of town, which do exist, to go pick up boxes upon boxes of processed food because it's less convenient. It's less convenient. And so, it is an amazing thing to see, like the Michelin system, which my next book is about a woman who becomes a Michelin star inspector, which is super fun. And I can tell you more about that in a little bit. But the Michelin system, Denver just became a Michelin star city back in just a few years ago, I want to say. And they made an announcement today that they're expanding the Michelin region into Louisiana. So New Orleans is finally getting a nod, which they deserve, but also Mississippi, Alabama, the Carolinas, and further in Georgia outside of Atlanta. And that's showing you that is getting international notice for these restaurants that are really striving to up their game. And am I dubious of real fine, the 3-star Michelin restaurant where you go in Denmark? Oh my God, there's a restaurant called The Alchemist in Denmark, and it's like this 6-hour long theater presentation, and like it's like weird foam and things like that, and shaped like weird things. And it's several $1,000s to attend this. The reservations sell out in 3 seconds every quarter when they open them up. It's insane. And I don't think that that's what food is about. And that's not the type of food I generally write about, at least not without a sense of irony. But there is a sense of beauty in, going to Ireland and, going to the farm where the cows are milked to make the butter and the cheese, and, understanding like the character Niall, the love interest, who is dreamy, and I love him. He's wonderful. He is a foodie, just like Veronica, and he takes her to this farm to meet the happiest cows in Ireland because he refuses to buy milk or cream from any other dairy because they are, because he knows that they eat the sweetest clover in all of Ireland, and he knows the farmer has known him since he was born. And that level of connection to our food is something that I think in our fast-paced society we've lost touch with. And I think it's a beautiful thing to be that connected because food becomes literally part of us. And that's not to say that every food decision has to be made with utmost intentionality, but it's something I've struggled with my entire life. I grew up actually very food averse, and that's something I'm going to tackle in a future book someday. But learning to explore the world via food is an important thing because I think that we learn a lot about a culture by sampling their dishes. We learn about not just the produce and what they have access to, but what they care about or don't. And I find that fascinating. So that is, kind of my shtick about that. And to head off a question that I'm often asked, my next book is going to come out next May. May 5th, I think, is the tentative date, although this far out, it could change. And the tentative working title is The Other Side of Stars. And it is indeed about a Michelin star inspector. She's been working in the food industry for 15 plus years, and everything from the basic entry level chef, like the line cook, all the way up to general manager of a restaurant, and all the jobs in between, from the saucier, which is the sauce cook, which is kind of the god in the kitchen. You've got the head chef and the sous chef. They think they're amazing, but the heart of the kitchen is the saucier. And so that was very fun to write. The person that makes all the sauces, and learning about all the different mother sauces, and that sort of thing was a delight. And a sommelier, and she works in all these different jobs for a couple of years each, in order to qualify for to apply to become a Michelin guide inspector, which is I mean, the acceptance rate for becoming a Michelin guide inspector is extremely remote, extremely small. When they opened up the market in New York and they wanted to hire American Michelin guide inspectors, they had 2 positions open and they had like 6,000 people apply. So the odds are not in your favor. But she's worked hard, but she has sacrificed so much. And so it's an exploration of all these sacrifices she's made, and whether or not at the end of the day it was worth it. She's a bit like the dog that caught the car, and she has to decide whether or not this is the trajectory she wants to continue on. So that is my next contemporary book that will be coming out in 2026. And I have one more scheduled to come out in 2027, and the rest is up to the fates, and we'll find out. I deeply hope to write a book about the history of Estes Park, a historical fiction set here, Isabella Bird, and then, a little bit later with the founding of the park, and a present day timeline, perhaps, to tie it all together with a mystery, probably involving Rocky Mountain Gym, because that was super cool. The story, the history behind there. But yeah, that is basically my writing and everything in a nutshell. And so I think I'm good to start with questions a little early. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'll just mention for our online folks, again, just put your questions in the chat. For our in-person folks, um, if you want to raise your hands, I'll come over and put the mic in front of you. That way, when you say your questions, our online folks can hear your question as well. And you want to put the mic like about where I've got mine. All right, who's got questions?
Don't be shy. We'll do this Phil Donahue style, coming out into the audience.
Yeah.
Oh, got
Something interesting that you brought up was that there's topics that go in waves, and absolutely, I noticed I love historical fiction, the
Mhm.
World War II. I love that you're looking at the food, and that's going to be really fun
Mhm.
to a world that I don't know at all. But
Mhm.
do you know what the next wave is? I know it's not exactly.
I wish I did. I would have a contract for historical fiction at the ready. Actually, I have like 4 or 5 different proposals, which would be a fairly detailed synopsis and 3 or more chapters, languishing on my laptop because we don't know what's going to happen next. Um, and I've got actually one that's actually kind of tangentially World War II. I have a couple set in the 50s and 60s, one that's a bit of a time travel book. And then, triple timeline set here. I've got any number of ideas, but I don't think we know what's happening next. And so, what generally, I think they found out within a year or so, or even less than a year, that the next thing to follow on the Tudors was going to be World War II. But it's taken them longer to figure out, because they've had some books do phenomenally well, like The Women with Kristen Hanna, set in the Vietnam era. But there haven't been other books that kind of followed the trend that caught on. There have been a little bit of a trend toward the 50s and 60s, but I don't think it's enough to say that it's the next wave. And then, we've got a lot of outliers like The Frozen River by Ariel Lawton, which sounds amazing, but it's set further back in history, and it's American set, I'm pretty sure. I need to read more about that. My agent was telling me that it's an amazing book. Um, so that's, I think that because they haven't latched on to what the next big thing is, they've become a little bit conservative about acquiring what historical fiction for the time being. But I'm seeing a bigger variety being acquired right now, for the people who are fortunate enough to have contracts. I just haven't had the time to go out on submission yet, because I haven't latched on to which of my 5 or 6 ideas I want to do next. But likely it'll be the Estes Park book, I think, knock on wood. And but yeah, I think we don't know quite yet, and hopefully we'll figure it out soon. But also, it's nice when it doesn't get glutted. World War II has just been so saturated for so long. And I don't think the Tudors, it was quite to that same degree, but there are only so many Tudors to write about. And the Henry VIII's third cousin twice removed might have a fascinating history, but you can get too far into the weeds. And I think Philippa Gregory, in that 15-book series on the Plantagenets and the Tudors, she got about as comprehensive as one could do without getting too obscure. But she did latch in on 15 or more amazing characters in those books. Yeah. All right, more questions? Do we have one online?
Yeah, we got one from online. So, um, the questioner asks, of the books you've written, which is your favorite? And I'll open that up a little. You could be your favorite to write, your favorite to reread, your favorite to use as a coaster,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, this is like asking me which one of my children is my favorite. I tell them whichever one's behaving best at the time, and they can feel free to make it a competition if they want. My emotional favorite is A Bakery in Paris, sitting over there. So back in 2020, I was at loose ends because it was pretty clear that Lake Union, because their sales um, expectations are huge. I'd sold over 50,000 copies of Across the Winding River. By any other publisher standards, that would have been like, well, here, sign on the dotted line, and we're going to give you a raise. Well, depending on how big your advance was. 50,000 books for like a Kate Quinn advance would be disastrous. But for me, it's great. And that meant earning out my advance in like 3 weeks, which was fabulous. But I was really at loose ends, and I was dating this wonderful historian. He said, "You should write about the Paris Commune, Amy. You majored in French, you know about that." And I Googled it to remind myself what it was, because it'd been a minute since grad school. And it's after the siege of Paris in 1870, where for the first time out of three in the course of less than 100 years, the Germans invaded and caused trouble. Gosh darn them. And so they came in, caused trouble, and Paris was surrounded and was starving, much like the siege of Leningrad, for a number of weeks. And the people were furious. I mean, the emperor was nowhere to be found, and there were people starving in the streets. They ate the zoo animals. It was terrible. And so after that got resolved and the Germans packed up and went home, the people of Paris revolted, and they wanted to govern themselves. They said, "We're done with this monarchy nonsense. We've already had a revolution. Why are we doing this again?" And they ended up forming their own government. And they just weren't organized enough, and they got put down. 2 months later, it was a huge massacre. 25,000 Parisians lost their lives at the hands of the Versailles troops, without anything resembling due process. But it was this absolutely monumental period in French history that gets overshadowed by the French Revolution and the World Wars. And so I did a double timeline because it was my first time in many books transitioning away from World War II. So I set one of the two timelines post World War II. So we've got Paris in ruins and Paris being rebuilt. And we got a character searching for her mother who went missing in the final days of the war, and trying to rebuild, and a sense of hope and prosperity returning to Paris. And so I love the compare and contrast in those. And the cool part was I was on a road trip with said amazing historian, and we found out the news that I got a contract for that book on our honeymoon. So that was a lovely story. And the bakery's green because he's a May baby and his birthstone is emerald. So that's why the bakery had to be green. My little nod to my husband. So lots of green books, though. I have a lot of green books lately. Yeah, lavender and sage would be a nice contrast because it's purple. Set it off a little bit. But I'm really getting into my contemporary books, I have to say, because they're exploring things. They're a challenge because I don't have the scaffolding of history to build on to create the character arcs. I have to create everything myself. And history, they do a lot of the heavy lifting for you when things have already happened. Even if you're creating characters from scratch, and having them react to historical events. Those historical events, you have to respect those. There's a timeline. and it really helps create structure. And then, when you're doing contemporary fiction, you have to create all that yourself. It's hard. And so I realized with Lavender, The Memory of Lavender and Sage, which came out last year, it was my first contemporary, that I had to find some external pressures to put into it. Around draft 3, I realized that's what's missing. And so I found articles about how the French villages are emptying out and how cafe culture is dying. Everybody's moving to the big cities. And it's really a crisis for French culture as we know it. And they have what's known as the empty diagonal that goes from the northeast to the southwest. It expands into Spain. And in Portugal, most of the villages have nobody under the age of 60 in them because they all lived in Lisbon and Porto, because that's where the jobs are. And there's a huge swath of Spain that's the same way. Um, and so but the death knell for any village is when the school closes, because that means no new families will move in. And these are decisions made at, like, a really centralized level. France has a very strong central government, and they take care of whereas here in the States, obviously, a lot of educational decisions happen not even at the state level, but at the local level or the district level. And a lot of the decisions happening even at the district level are being mandated from a central governing body. And so if they say close that school, it's going to close. And so you have a community. One of the main issues in that book is the community wanting to keep their school open so that it doesn't mean the end of their way of life. And so that created some external tension to bring the book to life. And that, I think that worked really, really well. This one, I managed to, I mean, the big overarching social issue is just the complexities of adoption. But it is a little bit more of an internal drama. But I think it has an emotional resonance with people as well. So that's what I aimed to do. So more questions, comments, concerns, thoughts about life?
I can take another online question.
Yeah.
Let you all think for a minute. Okay, so this is a very specific question.
Cool.
About a specific book. I loved your main character in The Memory of Lavender and Sage and her gift in creating herbal remedies. What was your inspiration for the herbal medicine piece, and how did you research this topic?
Okay, so that was super fun. So Tempesta Luddington and the Seattle Times named her the best named character in the month of February 2024. So I'll take that. You can write that on my tombstone. Best named character. According to the Seattle Times. She has a gift with herbs, and she grew up in New York. She never even had plants on her balcony in New York because she didn't have the time for it. She's trying to make a living in she was trying to work in the finance industry at her father's behest for a number of years. That didn't work out. She gets a job as a food critic, which you'd think, hey, that's a great cushy job, but she hates it. She hates it because she has to put down people's work, and that's her job. Or she can't be honest and critique bad restaurants. That's the other side of the coin there. And then she moves to Provence, the village where her late mother had grown up, and she buys this ramshackle house sight unseen, and there's a greenhouse on the property, and it's like one of the most functional pieces in the whole thing. And she ends up at a farmer's market and buys a bunch of herbs because she figures, I've got a greenhouse, I need to do something with it. And she's kind of figuring out her life. And the next day she goes in, and these little seeds have gone crazy. And she has a greenhouse full of herbs. And so she learns that she has this affinity for herbs. And I did a lot of research about herbs. Culpepper's Guide to Herbs, that just dates back to the 17th century, was a great resource for that. And then the herbal symbolism of the Victorian era, and playing in with that. But she learns through mistake that she can imbue, if she makes food or products with these herbs, that she can influence people's emotions. And it's really kind of a metaphor for being able to bloom where you're meant to grow, because she was never meant to be in New York. She was never meant to live that life that her father was pushing her into. And when she comes to Provence and she's planted in the right soil, she's able to thrive. And so it's just a minor touch of magical realism, a bit more in the Wandering Season, and even more in The Other Side of Stars that's coming out next year. Yeah.
I know that you had mentioned that the last time you spoke that Tempesta was born in a storm. And that was
Yes.
part of the way that you chose that name. Could you just talk about that, about how you choose a name? Like a lot of authors will say, oh, we'll put your name in the book for whatever. You don't need $10,000.
Okay, we go pass around the hat. Anybody that donates $10,000 tonight, I will gladly name a character anything you want. Okay, yeah, that would be perfectly fine. No, Tempesta, I had this vision of her, and it ended up being somewhat ironic because she was not, I envisioned her being born in the midst of a storm and being this fiery person who is trying to fit into this like super straight-laced fundraising New York fancy family. And she doesn't. Like they live in the suburbs in Connecticut, and it's just not a fit for her. And she's got wild curly hair, and she just does not fit in and never has. And has been made to feel straight up unwelcome in her family by her grandmother, who is a lot. Her grandmother Lucille is a lot. And so that name basically came to me. So I researched a lot of Provençal. I'm a language nerd. I did the entire Duolingo Irish course for some Irish projects I'm working on. I've learned a bit of Provençal, but I lived in Provence and I wanted to incorporate some of the language. And there's a beautiful epic poem, Vincenzo e Mireio, which is the story of Vincent and Mireille, and it's the star-crossed lovers. It's like Romeo and Juliet with more class struggle, and it's a heartbreaking story. And I wanted to put elements of that in the memory of lavender and sage. And so her name basically just came out of the ether. Veronica Stratton. Okay, so one of my dearest friends, her last name is Stratton, and I just thought it was the coolest last name. It sounds so posh. I just loved it. And Veronica was my grandmother's confirmation name. She was devout Catholic, and I've always loved the name Veronica. My daughter was very close to being a Veronica, and she's mad I named her Aria instead, but she can live with that. That's fine. And anyway, I just loved that name, and I'd had it in my back pocket, and it finally worked for this project. There have been times I've had to shelve names I loved, and like when I was writing Girls on the Line, she came fully off the page and said, "My name is Ruby Wagner, and I'm pleased to meet you. And I'm from Philadelphia, and this is who I am." She just I knew who she was. She left off the pages of a research book, and other times I've had to rename characters because it just didn't fit. It just didn't fit. So it's really kind of like naming a child in some respects. I have to tell my husband, if you see baby naming pages open on my laptop, don't be worried, because it's just for naming characters usually. But I often, because you have to name a lot of characters over the course of a book. A lot of my books have many, many characters. So I will actually cut and paste lists of names, like appropriate, if it's historical, names that were popular in 1820 France. And of course, if you're writing Tudor era, it's like John, Edward, Henry, Mary, Catherine, Anne, Elizabeth. And so it makes it very easy and complicated all at the same time. And then, of course, in the case of Mademoiselle Eiffel, everybody came pre-named. But then when you've got two characters named Albert in the same family, you have to give one a nickname, whether they used it or not. They have to endure it for the course of my book. So yeah, it's kind of a process that changes from book to book. Yeah, okay. Give me 10.
Actually, that was curious, like your list. What is your writing process like? Are you on a computer in an office, or are you a roamer on a laptop? Do you write a lot in a notebook, or?
I started off writing by hand. I would write, but I was worried because ADHD squirrel brain. I was worried if I wrote the entire manuscript out by hand, I'd never type it up because it seems so tedious. So I'd write by hand for a day and then type it up. And then once I finished typing it up, if I had more time left, I'd just keep going in the story. And then the next day go back to writing by hand. And that's how I did my first book, and it worked fine. But I got to the point where I was more comfortable just writing on the laptop. And obviously it's faster. I'm not sure it's better. I'm not sure writing faster is better. But it does get words on the page, and bad words on the page can be edited into decent words on the page, which can be polished into good words on the page. And so often these days, if I am just drafting words, I'm often in my recliner trying to chase my cat off my side table because he's begging for treats. And and I work on a laptop or sometimes my iPad that has been made into kind of a distraction-free device with no other apps. I can reinstall the apps if I'm using the iPad for travel, but otherwise, it's kind of distraction free, which is good. I just need to throw this in the ocean, and that would help with my word count a lot because it is a huge distraction. And social media, and you can't say, oh, well, just don't go on social media when it's part of your job. And a very annoying, and yeah, but it's fun. There are aspects of it that are fun, but it is draining. So I draft my entire books out in Scrivener, which is a program specifically for long form writing, for whether it's fiction, dissertations, or screenplays, what have you. And it was an investment of $40 back in the day, and it's been great. I love it. And you can move things around, or if you want to skip ahead, you can like insert I need to put a scene here with character development about this, and then move ahead and dig where the ground is soft. I try to write in chronological order as much as possible, but sometimes you get stuck and you just jump ahead to a different scene or something. In Mademoiselle Fell, one thing I did was I really wanted to write the Eiffel Tower scenes when I was fresh, and still am very excited about the project, even though it was coming toward the end of the second act. So pretty far into the project, I didn't want to feel rushed or hurried. So I wrote the first act, made sure it was pretty, that I had a good handle on the characters, and then jumped ahead to the Eiffel Tower scenes. And, it meant I had to edit, make sure that the emotional arc made sense. And it turned out to not be as big of a headache because, I knew where Claire was going to be in relationship with her husband by that point, for example. But that was a book where I really wanted to nail those scenes. Because if I could rewrite one book, and I would hate to do this to myself, it would be The School for German Brides, about the Nazi bride schools, which is a harrowing book that I wrote in the middle of lockdown. Single parenting, my kid, writing in 300-word stretches in the middle of the night, bought a Google Assistant to turn off my lights so I didn't have to get out of bed to get up and turn the lights off. It was like the hardest book I've ever written from that perspective. But if I could go back, I would write the bride school chapters first, because that's what we have to build up to. But in a sense, the title, The School for German Brides, is a metaphor because we've got a German woman and a Jewish German woman who are both, entering the state of matrimony under very different circumstances. Neither of them great circumstances. And so it really is a metaphor. It's not just about the Nazi home ec school, which was terrible. But, it was a topic where I wish I'd kind of delved into the actual Nazi home ec schools a little bit more and done it when I was a bit, less pressured in the midst of a deadline. So that's just something I've become more and more aware of. Is just I want to deliver the punch. When a book is supposed to be about a bride school, I'm going to focus on that. Eiffel Tower, I knew I had to nail those chapters. People are going to see the cover of Mademoiselle Fell with a giant Eiffel Tower on the front. And if it doesn't have a lot of Eiffel Tower content, they're going to be like, what the heck? Because it was such an important, a monument in Parisian history. And it's a center of her father's career. And it had to play a huge part in the book.
So when you've written books like The Bakery in Paris or The German Bride School, where there's stories about two different characters and then
Mhm.
they come together, do you write all about one character or do you go back and forth? Like, reading it, you go back and forth, but what's your writing process on those?
That's a great question, and I learned a lot. So in my first two books, where we have three characters, I just alternated. And I wrote, I wrote everything in order that it was supposed to appear in the book. for better or for worse. And I learned when I did that again in Across the Winding River that I was losing a lot of time because I would be in Max's headspace, for example, and then I'd have to switch to Johanna or Beth. And it made sense to skip ahead and do like 3 Max chapters. And, and while I was still motivated to do that, and just take notes about what needs to happen in the interspersing chapters, and just to keep momentum going. It's all about momentum in so many respects. Now, I did something very courageous with A Bakery in Paris, and I wrote all of Lisette's timeline, and then I wrote all of Michelin's timeline, and then I was supposed to write a present day timeline with a character named Veronica Stratton, and I cut it because it just wasn't working. I tried to write those first chapters several times, was not working. I could not do it to save my life. So I emailed my editor and I said, Tessa, okay, we pitched this book. It's been announced. And how mad would you be if I cut the present day timeline? And she's like, you've got to do what your muse tells you. And so I felt very respected by that response. Like, you've got to do what you feel is best for the book. And so I cut poor Veronica, and I've since given her her own book. And I may actually resurrect some of those other chapters for another project, which will be fun. It's always great when you can reuse old things. And but so what I did was then at that point, because Lisette's section was 50,000 words. And us mortals down here on the ground, we're generally limited to 100,000 words. Somebody like, Ariel Lawton or, Kate Quinn, they can get 150, 200,000 words and nobody will bat an eyelash. But books, cost money to produce and to edit. There's a lot of expense that goes involved. It gets involved. So I'm limited to 100,000 words. So Lisette was already at 50,000 words. Micheline was at 30. And so I'm like, well, I can just expand that. And it was easy to do because there was so much. And then I like, well, I got to shoehorn these 2 narratives into a story. And I was so worried about it, guys. I was so worried. And it worked. I did not feel like there were awkward transitions. But then the cool thing I got to do, because I had enough word count, was to put the recipes in between and, make them part of like a chef's notebook. And so these are not actual recipes that you can follow. They don't have like all the method and everything because they're based on the original Carême recipes, which are pages and pages long, and they're like industrial size, like 6 pounds of flour and things that we just normally wouldn't do. And so don't try to follow those recipes. If you go to my website, you can find better recipes that you can actually have good results with. But I was able to add those in, and I think it added a really kind of special element because it's like notes about how to make it better and different flavor pairings. And I felt like it was just something that helped add a layer to the book. And I had the wiggle room to do it. And I love doing it. I took original translations of Carême recipes and morphed them into something that would fit in the book. And that was a lot of fun to do.
All right, we have time for one more question. If I don't see any from our online friends, so
Come on, one more, guys. You can do it.
I could come up with a question if I needed to, in a pinch.
I was just wondering while she was asking what process you use, how AI has affected your work. Is it streamlined anything or at writers as a whole?
There is a huge backlash against using AI in the professional writing community. 9 of my books have been used by Meta, have been pirated by Meta illegally to train its generative AI. And I've messed with it because I feel like I need to understand what I'm up against. And I think generative AI is still extremely weak. The worry is when it gets better. And I have a real problem with these companies that saying, well, we're going to generate these ideas, we're going to pick out ideas that we think are going to sell based on an algorithm. And then we're going to, we're going to put these, what do you call it, prompts into Chat GPT. And then we're going to have a human edit it so that we can copyright it. Because anything that is generated off Chat GPT can't be copyrighted. And so, I have some friends that use it for like creating a writer's schedule. Sure, no problem. Or even banding about like, help give me some title ideas. They're terrible. They're all like bad nonfiction titles. They're not going to work for novels generally. But the reality is that every search on ChatGPT wastes an entire bottle of water. From an environmental perspective. So I stay far away. I've used it just enough to understand how it works. And, I think it's very problematic. And I think that, there's always been talk of how independent publishing, like through Kindle or Kindle, what do you call it, Kindle Press or whatever, or other platforms, have flooded the market. And it's true. But at least human beings generally were profiting off of that. And so there were diamonds in the rough. There were diamonds in the rough. And those usually got picked up by traditional publishers if they were really all that great. Examples being like Colleen Hoover, for better or worse. I think she was independently published before she was traditionally published. And I think she's worthy of being. I mean, she sold more books in 1 year than the Bible, and so that's rather incredible across all of her titles, obviously. So obviously she's a decent storyteller. I'm not super familiar with her work, but so there's a real room for independent publishing, like in historical fiction. If you want to write a book about some obscure topic in Latvian history, you might write a bang up book, and there will be a great audience for that book, but no publisher is going to touch it. But then they see that it's been successful and they can pick it up. But there was a worry that that was going to flood the market, and it absolutely has. It absolutely has, and is cut in to the profits of traditional publishing. But I think that at least the outcome was there was actual human beings getting their voices heard, and it was very democratizing in a way. Because yes, there are gatekeepers that say your work is worthy and your work isn't. And even those of us who have been lucky enough to publish, this is book number 12, folks. So I'm extremely fortunate. I make my living doing this, which is a rare thing to be able to say. But yeah, it's hard because they guide you in very specific ways because they think it's going to sell, and that always has to be a primary concern. So, yeah. All right,
Great.
good job, guys. Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much for joining us on
Oh,
this slightly snowy evening. Thank you all for bringing your good questions. I want to thank our partner, McDonald Bookshop, for being here with books and helping promote the talk. And finally, I want to thank the Friends of the Library Foundation for supporting everything we do. I will be sending out to folks who registered. I will be sending out a survey email. I'd love it if you could fill that out and just let us know what you thought of tonight's talk. It's always good to get feedback and ideas from folks. And I'll put a little piece of paper out if you'd like to. If you give me your email, I can send you that survey. And the email will also have the link to McDonald's site and the book, The Wandering Season, in our catalog, and Amy's site. Yeah, and let's see. Oh, and we have we have books. Amy will be here to chat
Yeah.
and sign books. And thank you all so much for coming and for joining us. Thank you also to the folks online.
Thank you very much, everybody.